You're watching Cablevision, Channel 14, local origination programming, your hometown network.
Welcome to Mind Over Matter. Real pleasure today to have as my guest Detective Sergeant William Brooks, who is with the Norwood Police Department and widely known for his interest in the mental health field in general, police training and police involvement in psychiatric emergencies in community settings. Thought it might be very helpful if we could pick up on some of the recent publications about your work and maybe talk a little bit about some of the more proactive things that you and your department get involved in terms of helping people in crisis.
Sure. Well, what you're alluding to is a story that was on the front page of the Daily Transcript this week, and kind of a passing reference in a Globe article the previous weekend about the Norwood Police Department's efforts towards drug intervention. And drug intervention is a program that we began really back in the early 1990s as a result of the rise in heroin in the northern Norfolk County area. Mm-hmm. We were seeing heroin use on the street where we hadn't seen it before. We had seen a couple of overdose deaths. We were very concerned at the way that the drug was really gripping the people who were using it and how quickly the addiction set in. And oftentimes the role of the police has been to just to try to go out and make an arrest if a person possesses the drug, or particularly detectives target dealers. And those cases can be very long and involved and take some time. During that time, sometimes when we're trying to catch up with a dealer, the addiction is setting in even to a greater degree with the individuals who are using the drug. And we really wanted an upfront, assertive, aggressive approach so that we could intercept addiction in the very early stages. And what we began doing was going out typically in the days following the arrest of a dealer. We would visit the homes of known addicts whose dealer had presumably just been arrested. And we would just confront them with what we knew and say, hey, look, we're not here to lock you up today. That may happen down the road, but we're really here right now to talk to you about what we know about your drug addiction, and you've simply got to do something about it. You can't go on like this. And we really experienced just a variety of responses to that. Most of the people, quite surprisingly, were fairly receptive to us.
Are they curious how you know, how you come to knock on their door?
They're curious, and we don't divulge it. We want to protect the people who have told us about it, mm-hmm. And that's not an issue. It's really not an issue as to how we found out. The issue is that they're addicted, they're using it on a daily basis, they've lost their their self-control over the use of the drug. It's affected them financially and socially. It has criminal implications in the community, and we're there to really intercept that and to intervene. Mm-hmm. And our goal is to, first of all, get them to admit that they are addicted, which we know going in, but it's important for them to admit it. And then we follow up by telling them that we want to help them arrange for treatment.
Now, who's we?
Usually the detectives do interventions in pairs. Mm-hmm. Detective Peter Kelly was interviewed for that transcript article with me, as he was for a Boston Globe article in 1996. And he's been very active in drug interventions. All of the detectives have been involved in drug intervention, but Detective Kelly's particularly aggressive and has paired up with me many mm-hmm. times. So once we get the person to admit that they really do need some attention, some of them have never explored treatment before. We carry a list of detoxes right with us. We'll ask them if they have health insurance, and if they do, we go through those steps. If they don't have health insurance, a lot of people don't realize that there's many state-subsidized programs that are free for people without health insurance. And we sit down and we start making calls. And
right in their home.
Right in their home. Now, there are a couple of cases where we use other resources. The town of Norwood employs a full-time substance abuse counselor, Pete Wall. He has an office at the Civic. Mm-hmm. And another tremendous resource for us has been Harriet Beasley, and she's the first assistant chief probation officer at the Dedham District Court. And she's particularly effective with women addicts and with very young addicts. And sometimes they help us find a program that's just right for that particular addict. For instance, if we bring in a young woman, would we be more likely to go to Harriet with the young woman, and she would find perhaps a program that caters to women and women's issues. So we try to identify a bed at a detox with the heroin addicts and make arrangements for them to get there. Sometimes they're transported by family members, but oftentimes people who are addicted have lost their car, lost their job, been somewhat disowned by their families. And I would say now in about 40% of the interventions we do, we end up transporting to the detox. That's not something we started off doing, but we think it's important to make sure that they get there. It's also to make sure when they sign in that they let the staff know that it's okay if we call a check on them. It's not the police looking to lock them up on a warrant, it's the police calling, there's a follow-up to make sure that they're still there and exploring follow-up treatment and so forth.
So let's say you mentioned 1996, so let's say over the last 3.5 years, how many people have you been able to touch in this way, would you guesstimate?
You know, it's tough to keep records on it, but I would say that we've got to do at least 20 interventions a year.
20 a year.
So I'm sure that we've probably, over the time that we've been doing this, probably interacted with at least 50 to 75 people who are addicted. Most of our work has been in the area of heroin. That's really what brought it about. Certainly we've applied it to crack cocaine use. And we've even intervened with some people who are alcoholics, whose alcoholism was bringing them in constant contact with the police. And there's been times we've gone out to confront people about their alcoholism and really use the same technique to kind of leverage them into seeking treatment.
So you're doing a lot of work up front. Is the response of the healthcare system adequate? Are people getting the necessary detox, for example?
Yes, the detoxes have been very receptive, and they've been very good to us. When we first started doing it, I think they interacted with us with a little trepidation. They weren't too sure why the police were here with the addict and so forth. And but we actually have some relationships with some of the detoxes, and they've been very good to deal with. It's also important that the addict go from the detox to a follow-up program. With the heroin people, I believe that they should go to an inpatient program of maybe 30 to 60 days. Really, the detox is not going to do it. They really need intensive inpatient treatment over a period of time. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. When it doesn't, it's more likely to be because the addict resists it and doesn't want to go inpatient. They want to get back out and get back to their lives. We have had some problems with HMOs, and this is something that, as police officers, we never had to deal with before.
Right.
But you get an HMO on the phone and they say, gee, we don't think that addiction is too severe, why don't you just have them go to meetings? Of course, they don't want to pay for the bed. We believe that if the person's addicted to heroin, it's important that the behavior be interrupted and that their environment be changed, that they go someplace else and they really get some intensive attention. The HMOs don't always think that. If the person's only shooting a couple of bags a day, that addiction isn't really enough for them to... Yeah. So we've really had to kind of dance with some HMOs, and that's been frustrating for us.
But they dare say no, some of them, or they dare say maybe?
Last week I had an HMO tell me that a heroin addict shooting 2 bags a day should not be in a detox and should be home. And they told me that withdrawal would be uncomfortable for him, but if he really wanted to, he would accomplish it. And I was really floored by it, and told her so. I said, quite frankly, if this poor fellow didn't have health insurance, we'd be on our way to a detox, to a state bed. The fact that he has your company as an HMO is blocking us from that.
So what happened?
She acknowledged that was true, and we did make arrangements for him to go the very next morning to an inpatient, to an intensive outpatient program in the area. And I've checked back with him, and I'm not convinced that he's doing well. So he needs some follow-up, and we need to stay in touch with him.
So she stood her ground, this gatekeeper for the HMO.
Yes. Kind of frustrating.
Okay. Well, I'm surprised because I mean they'll say no to us very often, and then we can kind of argue with them, and we win some, we lose some. I would think the police would have special standing and be harder to say no to the police.
You would have thought so. Of course, usually the protocol is that it's the patient that's on the phone with the HMO and trying to make his own arrangements. And when he told me the problem he was having, I called back and I said, this is the police, this man's in our office, we're involved in this, we really need to get him in. And I was actually kind of aggressive and assertive with her, and I couldn't budge her.
Couldn't budge her?
Couldn't budge her. She said that he could go home, and maybe if he went to an outpatient, they'd give him some medication to take it home. And it's just my experience that just doesn't work. It doesn't work with an acute addiction.
No, of course not. Now, if I'm at home watching the show, can I call and ask for this kind of an intervention?
Yes. There's a couple of different ways that people can do that. In fact, there's probably about 3 easy ways they can do it. First of all, they can call us at the BCI. That's the detective squad at the Norwood Police, and that number is 762-1173. That's a direct line. If somebody calls us and says, listen, I'm addicted and I need some attention, we're not going to run out and arrest them because they're addicted to that drug. We're going to do the intervention, and we're going to get them into treatment. And that happens when these articles come out, both in the wake of the Globe article in '96 and this most recent article. We've received a couple of calls. The second thing they can do is they can call Pete Wall, the substance abuse counselor, and his number is 762-2845. And he can take care of them directly, and he will find them better to detox. He's very effective, and he's been a wonderful resource for us. And then the third thing that they can do is that they can call the court, which is 329-4777. And if they want to talk to Harriet...
That's the Dedham Court.
That's the Dedham District Court. And if they want to talk to Harriet Beasley, they can do that. Sometimes family members go directly to the court in order to enter into... to petition the court for Section 35, and that's an involuntary commitment. Sometimes a family member will find that they have a son or a spouse or a daughter who's so addicted, they've discussed treatment, the addict won't go into treatment, that they actually take that step of going to the district court and asking a judge to compel the person, to make the person into treatment. And there is a way to do that, and typically it's the probation department at the Dedham District Court that handles those Section 35s. And family members who may have someone in their family who's been through treatment over and over, now is resisting it and will not go back, they can certainly call the court and inquire about an involuntary commitment. And Harriet Beasley would be the one to talk to.
And that's on Monday through Friday?
That's Monday through Friday business hours.
Right.
Yes.
So if you were to pick somebody up on a Section 35 over the weekend, they'd stay in the jail until Monday morning?
Section 35 warrants can only be served during court hours. So even if a judge were to issue, it's called a warrant of apprehension. If the judge issues a warrant of apprehension on a Friday evening, we really have to hold that until Monday morning, because the person is picked up. They're not incarcerated. They're not put in a cell. They're picked up in the field, and they're taken directly to the court and turned over to the court for a hearing on this petition. So they cannot be served when the court's not in session. People obviously can call the police department anytime, and we've received some calls very late at night. And if people don't reach us at the BCI, they can just call the main number at the police station and say that they're in a crisis and they're addicted and they need to talk to someone. And
that number is?
And that number would be the standard business number, 762-1212.
So that's for emergencies?
And that's for emergencies.
Okay. Well, why don't we stop at this point, and after the break, maybe we can talk about emergencies and the response to those emergencies.
It's fine.
Thank you.
The volunteers of Canine Connections, a nonprofit animal rescue organization, are working with Animal Control Officer Henry Secura to improve the conditions at the town shelter. Although the space is adequate for the number of dogs housed there, the facility is in need of modernization. Plans to improve the shelter include installing a cement floor in the outdoor pens, constructing a roof over the outdoor pens, and installing cabinets in the office so that food and supplies can be stored in a more efficient manner. Some funds have already been donated towards these projects, but more are needed to complete all of the projects. If you or your business would like to contribute to these much-needed projects, please send your check made out to Canine Connections NAS Fund to 25 East Hoyle Street, Norwood, Mass. 02062. If you have any questions, please call Linda at 781-440-0477. Your donation is tax deductible and will only be used towards the Norwood Animal Shelter.
Where have all the children gone? Long time passing.
Where have all the children gone? Long time ago.
Where have all the children gone? Gone to graveyards one by one.
Oh, when will we ever learn?
Oh, when will we ever learn?
Every day, 10 children are killed by gunfire. The killing won't stop unless you help stop it. Call 1-800-WE-PREVENT to find out what you can do. Not one more lost life, not one more grieving family, not one more.
Oh, when will we ever learn?
Well, Detective, I think there are a lot of people watching this show who really aren't aware of the kind of proactive things that the Norwood Police Department is able to do, other police departments are able to do in terms of helping people in crisis via drugs or mental illness, doesn't really matter. What are some of the emergencies that do come to your attention, and how do the police respond to those emergencies?
Well, in the area of substance abuse, sometimes we get a call from a family member who says, gee, my husband has been using, I think he's out, they typically say he's somewhat out of control, he's acting irrationally, and I suspect that he's back using drugs, and could you come down? And really, a lot of this rests on the shoulders of the first responding officer. It would typically be a patrol officer in a crisis situation. And the officer might get there, and he might, he'd of course be on the lookout for drug paraphernalia that he might see in open sight. If the subject is on the scene, he might have some conversation with him and look for some physiological indicators that there's some drug use going on. They might typically separate the caller from the subject and have two officers have separate conversations with them to see if they can figure out just what's going on. The police more and more now, will confront the subject and say, listen, we understand you're using drugs. What do you have to tell us about that? Obviously, we hope that the person who's addicted is upfront about it and talks about it and asks if we can give him some assistance being placed.
So he quickly is put on notice that you're not there necessarily to make an arrest.
We're not there necessarily to make an arrest. And people can, and like I said before, people can call and ask us to intervene or ask us to come down because there's a loved one who's using drugs.
But excuse me, but let's say I'm the loved one and you walk in the door. I would, if you're in uniform especially, I would be a nervous wreck that you're there to arrest. And how do I come to appreciate that you're there to provide some intervention that have nothing to do with arrest?
Well, for the most part, if you had called and asked us to intervene in that way, you'd want to make that clear when you make the phone call.
My wife called. I didn't even know she was calling.
Oh, you're the subject.
I'm the subject.
Oh, you're the
I
subject.
didn't even know she's calling.
Okay.
So you've now knocked on the door, and somehow, for some reason, you've taken her off to the kitchen, and now you're talking to me, and I'm a nervous wreck because you're a policeman.
That happens.
And I got a problem.
Right.
And I don't want you to know I have a problem.
That's right.
So.
Well, of course, like I say, the officer has to play a lot of this by ear. Sometimes we actually tell the person, listen, we are not here to arrest you. If I tell you I'm not here to arrest you, and I come upon drugs later on in the intervention, I won't make an arrest. If I've told you that, I won't make the arrest. Integrity is a big part of this. It's a big part of what we do. There are other times that, I might be there on a repeat call. I've dealt with the person 3 or 4 times, and quite frankly, arresting him might be good for the situation, and I'll get to that in a minute. And if that's my mindset, I'm not going to promise not to make an arrest, because if I do find drugs, that's something that I've decided that I just might do. But if an officer tells you, I come to your house and I tell you I'm not here to arrest you, then that's just not going to happen, and we can talk openly. Also, officers, I think, are pretty skilled at dealing with people. They learn very early and how to converse with people that might not want to divulge information. Our officers are particularly talented in saying, hey, listen, you've got a problem, we know you've got a problem, the neighborhood knows you have a problem. And that's why we've been called here. And the reason that we're called here a couple of times a month is because you have this little problem, and it's really about time that you take a look at it and see if you can't resolve it some way. And are you using now, or haven't you used in a couple of days? And you try to get some sort of sense for where the person's at. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of people that aren't open with us. There are plenty of people that continue to try to conceal what their problem is. But more and more we find, as we garner a reputation for doing these types of interventions, we find more and more people being up front and saying, listen, I'll talk to you, and I admit that I do have a problem. I'd really rather not go to jail. And if you can help me get into some treatment, we can talk about that. So our officers really have to interact with the person one-on-one and make their assessment as they go, and be somewhat flexible as they go. And the other point that I'd like to make, I think I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, that an arrest is not necessarily the worst thing that can happen. I don't set out to do it on my first contact with a person on an intervention. That's not what we're there for, clearly. But all of the treatment things that you and I have talked about do work with a person who's got a court case pending. And sometimes they work better. And they tend to work better if the person has been arrested and arraigned and placed on pretrial probation, so that they must attend the detox, and there are sanctions if they don't. They must go to the court once a week for a urine screen, and there are sanctions if they don't. And some of the people that we've dealt with, who we've done multiple interventions on, it ended up in an arrest on the fourth or fifth contact, and it was that particular intervention that was successful. And I come away with it thinking that I think we've done the right thing in the first few steps. But I can't ignore that once the person was finally arrested and went before the judge and had to deal on a daily basis with a probation officer and had to submit urine screens and had to go to a detox and had to go to meetings and have their card signed, that there's some benefit to that. A lot of people who are addicted lack structure in their lives and lack a schedule and so forth. And sometimes court involvement gives them that structure and that schedule that they were otherwise lacking. So people who call really have to put the situation in our hands and trust our judgment to a great degree. Personally, I think that arrest is sometimes called for in these situations. Not always, but sometimes it is.
You know, you know this show is sponsored by the Alliance for the Mentally Ill. Very hard for family members, I think, to get that message.
Yes.
And to feel that they are responsible for the arrest. And yet I think we both have had many experiences where when it's court-ordered, when there are charges pending, people take their problem more seriously and are compliant with treatment, sometimes for fear of, you know, obviously incarceration, but nonetheless do follow up sometimes better than they would if it weren't imposed by the courts.
That's true, and you made a couple of good points. One is the obvious threat of the sanction. And number two, there's really something to be said for the officer saying, you know, your wife isn't wrong, you do have a problem. And the probation officer saying, you know, I'm looking at your record, I'm looking at all these police contacts, I'm looking at your history with the department, and gee, this wouldn't be happening if you didn't have a substance abuse problem. And then the judge saying, you know, you really have to do something about this substance abuse problem. And coming out the other end, that person sometimes says, gee, maybe I have a substance abuse problem. Maybe it's not, maybe I don't have a nagging wife, maybe I have a substance abuse problem.
What about the fellow who says, though, I have a nagging wife? She exaggerates, you know, it's a small problem, it's not real, I got it licked, or I'm in good control, and she's really making a deal out of it, and I'm kind of annoyed with her for having involved you. How do you respond in a situation like that?
Well, all I can do is tell them what I think. I think that there's some benefit to them hearing from the drug counselor that they have a problem and hearing from the judge that they have a problem and so forth, like I just talked about. But quite frankly, you know, if you're using drugs and the drug use is causing repeated police contacts, then you have a drug use problem, period. If you drink alcohol and that never causes you a problem, then maybe you don't have a drinking problem. But if you drink and when you drink it causes problems at work, and the drinking causes problems in the home, and it causes repeated police contacts, and it causes other negative impacts on your life, then you have a drinking problem. You might not think of yourself as an alcoholic, but there are people out there who drink and have a wide range of problems. And if they just don't drink, they find that the problems begin to go away. And when they start drinking again, the problems come back, whether they're domestic, or police, or work problems, or problems with the neighbors, or problems with their children, or whatever they are. So they take the alcohol away, or the drugs, the problems begin to correct themselves, miraculously almost. And then when they start to drink again, the problems kind of come back. And sometimes, lots of times, people don't get that in the first trip. Sometimes it kind of has to happen over and over. And when we deal with people who are addicted, you know, we like to say to the family member as we're ready to go to the detox, you know, this probably won't work the first time. This person will come out and is very likely to relapse early. You know, the key is that we catch the relapse early. And that
Do you follow these people? Are you able to?
Yes, we are, depending on their situation. Particularly if they're in a family and they're going to return to the family, we'll talk to the spouse, or we'll talk to whoever else is in the household and say, you know, can you tell when he's using drugs? And they invariably say yes. They might not be able to identify what makes them think that, but intuitively they know when the person's using drugs. And we tell them, you need to tell us when you know that that person's using drugs, and have us come right back. And the more quickly that happens, the more effective our follow-up will be. And we do have to make repeated trips. There are people that we have done interventions with 6 and 7 times. And there are people we've worked with 6 and 7 times that I know have relapsed and are out there now. And we have to catch up with those people.
You know, it's interesting, because certainly it's been my experience as well, that for a lot of people, sobriety is the beginning of their trouble. And I think sometimes there's so much emphasis on getting to a detox that people sometimes begin to think, well, once I get to the detox, when I leave the detox, miraculously my problems will go away, when all the reasons why they were abusing substances surface once they are sober. So, for example, many people get depressed when they get sober. Many people start now having to deal with the financial problems, the marital problems, the employment problems that have all accrued that may be causing stress and also driving the person to drink or drugs.
Yeah. I think the substance has probably something to do with that. Some of the heroin and cocaine people that I've dealt with have said, boy, since I stopped using drugs, I never realized how financially well I was doing at work. But you're absolutely right. When the drug use is causing them problems holding a job, or they're being paid by the hour or by the day, and it's causing them other financial problems. And when they get sober, yeah, they're kind of left to deal with it. When I see, and we've concentrated talking here about the detox is really the first step. The detox is just to medically supervise the person through withdrawal. The really important part, I think, is the second step. If they're going to go to a 30-day program, a 60-day program, or they're going to do an intensive outpatient, that's what's really important. And when I talk to somebody coming out of a detox, very often they stop by the office, or we'll see them on the street, or they'll call. And I am much more impressed with the addict who says, boy, you know, I feel better, but do I have a long road? I feel much better about that person than I do the person who says, thanks, that was great, I'll remember you, see you later, I appreciate it, because I know it's just a really short matter of time before there's a relapse around the corner, because the person doesn't get it.
Absolutely.
They don't get that this is really the very first step in a very long road.
Okay, the long road. After the break, maybe we can talk about the long road and how you get people to take the next step in that journey. Thank you.
What would you do if you had to choose between the buffalo and the giraffes? Between a flower or an elephant? What would you choose? What if you had to decide between a 100-year-old tree and a 1,000,000-year-old beach? Between drinking clean water or breathing clean air? Would you make the right choice? Would there be a right choice? Now there's a way to help. Not just one, but all these things. Earthshare, the world's leading environmental groups working together. It's one choice we can all live with. Ask your employer about workplace giving.
Do you know how to escape a fire? Well, would you believe you could learn the answer from a baby?
If you get caught in a fire, here's what you should know. Get down on your knees and you remember, please, to keep your body low. You just got to fall and crawl, that's all, and you get out of the fire. Fall and crawl, that's all, and you get out of the fire. If it gets smoky around you, so cloudy that you can see, just cover your face and get out of that place and fall and crawl just like me. You just got to fall and crawl, that's all, and you get out of the fire. Fall and crawl, that's all.
All right, let's pick up with the long journey. People have responded positively to the intervention. I suppose at some point we ought to go back and just deal a minute with somebody who says, I'm not interested, please leave my house. But let's put that aside for the moment. The long journey. After detox, what happens, and what role do you play in terms of promoting people's involvement in longer-term programming?
The more time that goes by, the less frequent our contact with them becomes. I think that this program would probably work best if we had more people and more time, and I guess that's the old story, if we could just stay in contact with all of the people that are out there that we've worked with, because I think it would be beneficial. But realistically, we only have so much time to devote because we have all our standard investigations and all our other duties. Oh. So when the person has come out of, let's say, a detox and maybe gone into a 60-day program, and then they come out, hopefully...
Now, do many of them go to 60-day programs? I'm under the impression that they're less and less available.
They are less and less available, and the people are very, very reluctant to do it because that's a real commitment. And they feel so good in the detox that they are less and less likely to go to the 60-day program. But if we can get, and that's why we call into the detox while they're there, to say, listen, would you, how receptive are they to going someplace else? And typically the counselor says, oh, she doesn't want to go anywhere, she wants to go home today. And we'll say, would you tell her that I called, use my name, and tell her I'm real interested in her attitude and whether or not she's going to do the right thing. And sometimes that little, I just call it police leverage, just as that little nudge is sometimes enough, not always, but sometimes. We hope that, I feel that the more intensive inpatient that the addict does, the better off they're going to be. The 7 days in the detox certainly isn't going to do it. The 60 days is a little bit better. If the person went to a 3-month or a 6-month halfway house, that's even better in my mind. And we've had people that have gone that route, that have come out after 8 months of inpatient treatment that stemmed from an intervention that we did. And I think that those people now they have a good shot at sobriety out in society. But they still have to follow up. They have to do meetings. They have to go to meetings every day. They have to keep their mind clear. An officer I work with told me the other day that he was talking to someone who had a substance abuse problem. I think it was alcohol, and he had been sober for years. And he said to him, do you still go to meetings? And the guy said, only when I think I've really got it licked, which I think is a neat lesson, that if they get too comfortable, I think they have to go back and kind of remember where they came from. So we do try to make contact. Sometimes it's just phone contact. We will pick up the phone and call the house of an addict that we've dealt with to just say, listen, we're just calling to see how things are. Sometimes we see them on the street and stop. It's not unusual for them to stop in the office and say hello, particularly when they're doing well. They're less likely to do that when they're not doing well.
So do you just do this as the spirit moves you, or do you keep lists of people so that you have at least a kind of a systematic way of knowing who you were involved with and who might benefit from a phone call?
We do a couple of things. We have a book in the squad room. We just call it the heroin book. And there's a page in there on any person we've identified as being an addict. And we kind of have a rule of thumb. We really don't take the page out once it goes in there. I mean, anybody can relapse at some point. And so there are people that have been in that book for a couple of years that are probably doing well, but we just hate to completely forget about them. And it's worthwhile to flip through that from time to time. If we're working on an active group, I do keep a list of the people that are in that group, any of the people we've identified as being affiliated. And that list can get kind of long because, this one deals with that one who sells to this one this is the girlfriend and she's using too, and she's got a friend here. And sometimes that kind of tree gets a little convoluted, but we do try to kind of keep a list just to kind of keep track. And quite frankly, we do a lot more interventions when our caseload is low. When our caseload is high, if we're getting a lot of sex assaults and robberies and embezzlements and computer crime and suspicious deaths and all the stuff that detectives do, when we're doing a lot of that stuff, it's tougher to get to interventions. There's only 4 detectives working investigations, and I'm their supervisor. So when we're busy with cases...
You're the 4th or the 5th?
I'm the 5th.
You're the 5th.
So when we're busy with other cases, sometimes, and there are times, I fold up an index card and I write the person's name on it, and I stand it up on my desk as a reminder to get to that person. And sometimes those index cards will stay there for a week or 2 before I finally get just a free moment to go out and see them. An intervention will take several hours, and it takes 2 of you to do it.
Absolutely.
So unfortunately, sometimes they have to wait until we kind of get to them. And that's unfortunate, but it's just the reality. It's just the way it is.
Do you work with other departments, other police departments?
Yes, we do. We've done some training with other departments, some formalized training in the in-service setting. And then there are other departments that are in our task force region. The Norwood Police Department is a member of the NORPAC task force, and it's 15 police departments in Norfolk County. And we're all cross-designated, so we can cross jurisdictional boundaries anyway. And there will be a time, for instance, if we're doing a Norwood intervention and we find out that that person is dealing with an addict in Walpole or Dedham or Canton or some other town, we'll want to follow that up. We want to do an intervention with that person in the next town because it has some impact on the success of the person we just dealt with. We very much try to address these people in cells and groups, and the more contact we have with the more people, and the more successful we can be overall. So no, it's not unusual for us to then call the neighboring department and say, we'd like to do an intervention. The person is associated with people in our town, but they're living in your town. We'll send 2 people up to team up with one of your detectives if you'd like, or one of us will come up and go with 2 of yours, or 1 and 1, or whatever you'd like. And we've done that very successfully. We've been to many of the surrounding towns and teamed up with those detectives to do interventions.
And they're receptive, as you say, and
Well, the departments are very receptive.
Yeah.
The departments are receptive because we've been doing it for a number of years, and I think they see that it works, and now they've kind of picked up on it. And when we've done interventions together, information flows from it, and they get to meet the people, and very often the interventions are successful, and that's helpful.
Okay. So back to the long road. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head where there are 60-day programs. It's very hard. I mean, detoxes today are 3 to 5 days.
Right.
And then the step-down programs might be, you hope, would be 30 to 60 days?
Yeah, they vary.
Where do you find them?
Sometimes we hear about them primarily from Harriet Beasley, the probation officer, because she has probationers that are in those programs. Pete Wall, we use him as a referral. We might say, listen, we've got somebody in a detox, and they're looking for another program, and he might find one. But when you go into a detox, there's a counselor assigned to you, and one of the things they do is kind of urge you to follow up and go into another program. So we're not as involved with placing a person in a 60-day program as we are with the detox. We view the police role as kind of getting them into the system and doing a little bit of follow-up while they're in there, but if they're at a detox, we know that there's a counselor at that detox that's working on getting them to go to the next step. The problem is that there's some confidentiality around it, number one, and number two, there's the view that if the addict really wants to get sober, it's really up to the addict to do that, and if the addict isn't going to commit to it, then no amount of pushing is going to be worth it. And I don't know as I agree with that 100%. And that's why we call into the detox and get the counselor on the phone. And sometimes the counselor will tell us, I'm having absolutely no luck with this person, and he doesn't want to follow up. And he says he's fine, he wants to go home now, I think he's packing as we speak, and he's on day 3. And sometimes we actually get the addict right on the phone, like I mentioned, or we get the counselor to pass on a message to just say, you tell him the police called. He waived his confidentiality when we dropped him off 3 days ago, and you tell him that we've called and we're very interested in what his plans are, and if he's coming back to town, we're going to have to sit down with him because we're just not thrilled with that plan. And sometimes just that kind of contact has caused them to rethink that and stay a little bit longer or go to another program and make some follow-up plans.
Now, what gives you the right to suggest that if he checks out early, you'll sit down with him?
Probably nothing. Probably nothing.
Okay.
But I'm not going to tell him I'm going to arrest him. I'm not going to tell him he's going to go to court. But I know that he was addicted 3 days ago, and he's been addicted for a year. And I really doubt that 3 days of treatment has completely undone that. And if he's going to come back to the community in 3 or 4 days, I'm just going to swing by and see how he's making out.
And you're able to do that?
Well, yeah. Yeah.
It's not an empty threat.
No. We would contact them. We would want to know. We want to know what their plan was. We obviously, we only have a certain amount of leverage. We only have a certain amount of authority. They don't always know exactly how much authority or how much leverage we have or how much information or evidence we have. And sometimes they're just not quite too sure. And that's fine.
That's helpful.
That's helpful.
Okay. Now let's just, because we only got a couple of minutes in this segment, let's just go back to the situation where you've gone in and someone isn't receptive. He's in denial, he's saying, nah, it's my wife, she sounds the alarm too often, too early, I'm fine, thanks very much. Now, you know that there's a bigger problem there. Do you have a strategy? Do you have some thoughts about that?
Yes, those are a little bit more problematic, but there's certainly ways to deal with them. First of all, it has to do with the way that we came about the information.
Okay.
For instance, let's say that we heard from a family member that the person was back using drugs. Early on, even before we contact the addict, we would talk to that family member and say, how do you know he's using drugs? And the person might say, hey, look, I found heroin in his room last night, and I took it. Well, do you know what heroin looks like? Have you seen it before? Oh, sure, I've seen it before because I found it in his room before. Well, now we know that the person possessed just within the last 24 hours. So they've committed a crime and done it fairly recently, and that gives us a little bit of leverage. Oftentimes when we first talk to the addict, they talk enough about their addiction so that their own words kind of confirm for us what we already knew. So a lot of it has to do with the way that we learned about the addiction and how much evidence we have. There's a provision in Massachusetts that I think I alluded to, Chapter 123, Section 35, and it's called an involuntary commitment. And there have been times when we've had enough knowledge and information about a person's addiction, and that person has been completely uncooperative, that we've told them, if you don't take our offer of a detox now, we will petition the Dedham District Court to commit you against your will. And as you know, your audience might know, but you certainly know that, male addicts and alcoholics are committed to 30 days at Bridgewater, and women go to either Framingham or a place that has a state contract to do Section 35s. Those are not empty threats. If I say, listen, I will petition the district court to have you committed, that's exactly what I'll do. And I'll leave the person's house and drive to the court. And either Ms. Beasley petitions the judge, or I've petitioned the court on several occasions and signed the papers and got the warrant of apprehension and picked the person up and brought them to the court. And then sit down with the court clinician and say, this is how I know he's addicted, and this is how I know the impact that his addiction is having on his family and having on him financially, and here's how I know the danger he is to himself and society. And as you know, a Section 35 hearing is a civil proceeding. It's not like a criminal trial. They're held the very day that we pick the person up. And the judges, not to say they've been good to us, I think they've been very receptive to the issue. They understand what we're trying to do. And when we testify in support of Section 35, or the clinician testifies about what we've told them, they're very interested in hearing the state of the person's addiction and their reluctance to plan a strategy to address it.
Good. Well, let's pick up after the break and continue this.
Very good.
Thank you.
It was called the greatest generation any society has ever produced. They were ordinary people who half a century ago did nothing less than help save the world. Millions served in uniform, millions more served at home, and nearly 500,000 gave their lives. And yet there is no national memorial to honor their sacrifice. It is time to say thank you.
Call now and help build the National World War II Memorial.
Brian's a student that I had in my resource class. Came from a very poor background. Brian just needed a friend, so we paired him with a community leader. He would take him to rodeos, and then he would take him to plays and different things that this child would never have been exposed to. This man taking his time to come and have lunch with him meant more than anything.
Point a kid in the right direction. This is General Colin Powell of America's Promise. Call us and help keep America's Promise.
Mr. and Mrs. Jones, Sally's having some behavioral problems.
I guess that reward system isn't working.
Well, the timeouts weren't either.
Parents do find that timeouts aren't...
See?
Well, you're just too lenient.
Well, you're too strict.
No, you are.
Oh, you are.
No, you are.
No, you are.
When adults don't have the answers, they can feel as frustrated as kids. ConnectForKids.org has thousands of resources for helping kids in your community. ConnectForKids.org, guidance for grown-ups.
I think it's been very helpful that we focused on substance abuse and specifically some of the drug problems that afflict the communities. Perhaps you could tell us in our last segment a little bit about some of your experience with interventions at work and maybe some interventions that don't work.
I guess that when the family is involved and the family is behind you, the interventions work better. And I think that, and it's said that sometimes a crisis is helpful in bringing about a person's desire to seek treatment. And I kind of look at our role as sometimes being the crisis, that the police show up at your door and start talking about heroin in your living room. And sometimes that's the crisis that really that it takes for people to kind of get over the edge. I also think it's helpful, like I talked about before, to kind of deal in groups. We dealt with a group of young women who were using crack cocaine. This goes back a few years, but it really worked very well. We learned about this small group of girls, and we did an intervention with the first one, and Harriet found her a bed, and we got her to a detox. And the next day we dealt with the other two, and they secured beds at separate detoxes, and by the end of that second day, the 3 girls were all at separate detoxes. And we had sat down and told the families everything that we knew. We're not going to hide something from a parent. We tell them exactly what we know about that person's drug use. And these 3 young women were all pretty forthcoming with their families and talked about their use of crack cocaine. And we found during the interventions that they had been getting the cocaine not from Norwood, but had been going into Boston, where a woman lived who they worked with. And they worked with her in Norwood. So when we were done with the last intervention, we went to the workplace. And we kind of introduced ourselves, being narcotics detectives. They were on a narcotics case, and we needed to do an interview. And I think that the owner of the business caught wind of exactly what was going on here. And by the end of a very brief interview, the woman had decided that she should perhaps leave and go work somewhere else and quit her job and do other things. She really confirmed for us during our brief interview that what we suspected about her getting drugs for the others was true. Of course, we didn't have jurisdiction to charge a crime there because it didn't happen here. But when it was all said and done, she approached the boss and said that she wanted to quit. And the boss had really caught wind of what was going on and asked us if we'd talk to him and be somewhat candid about it. And by the time we were all through discussing it, he was willing to make sure that those young women all had their jobs back when they got out, as long as they would submit to some drug treatment during the course of their employment, kind of be on probationary employment. And they're, interacting with their boss, and everybody kind of knowing what all the issues were, and him being understanding about their need to have the job back, his need to have them as employees, and everyone's need to make sure that they were drug-free. Was very helpful. And when they did get out, and they went through various treatment modalities of varying degrees, but when they all got out and they were ready to do outpatient, they all went back to work there. And he sat down with each one and discussed their past and what they should do in the future, and that he was going to be supportive, but they just weren't going to use drugs. And I think that was very helpful. Mechanisms like that are helpful, where you've got some structure to the addict's family, the family's supportive, even if you can involve employers. That's not the first time that we've found ourselves talking to an employer. We don't go out of our way to do that, but sometimes the employer can be a big help.
But there is a minor problem, and that's what if I don't want my employer to know? Now, you're suggesting that the employer's knowledge was very helpful in creating basically a long-term treatment plan that included reemployment, but
and in that case, the women knew that we were going to make that approach, and that was fine. We wouldn't do it without discussing it with the addict, and we wouldn't do it without his consent, because I think that there are trust issues there, and there are some issues about appropriateness. But one of the things that I think is that addicts tend to be able to continue to use in those situations where the people around them don't quite know what's going on. In those cases where their friends, their family members, the people at work at least have an understanding that they're dealing with this issue, that the addict can be more successful in his recovery. And there have been times when we're dealing with an addict and we've got him to go to a detox, and he says the only downside of this is that this is the last straw, and I think my boss is going to fire me. I've lost a lot of time off, and he's going to can me, and I'm going to lose my job over this. And we've said, we'll go and talk to your boss. We need to be candid and tell him what's going on. But in most cases, the boss suspects you've got a drug problem and is wondering when you're going to address it. And if I go and sit down and tell the boss what you thought was absolutely right, and he has admitted it, and he's taking the proper steps, but it's going to be real helpful if his job is here when he gets out, you'd be surprised. Employees are very receptive to that. They at least know that the addict is taking the right steps, doing the right thing, and has finally addressed the problem. And in the circumstances where we've done that, it's been helpful.
Have you learned from some failures? I mean, and if so, what? Interventions that haven't worked?
Well, you know, in doing these interventions, the thing that's really difficult is defining the successes and the failures. You know, what if we do a series of interventions that leads to a person being sober for a year? Does that mean they're out of the woods? It certainly doesn't. By the same token, if we do an intervention and the person relapses right away, is that a failure, or does it simply mean that we're not done with them? So it's really kind of difficult to define the successes and the failures. Certainly a person who's been clean and sober for 5 years or so is well on his way. The failures really are the people, I think, who either who die of overdose before we're through with them. But beyond that, I can think of people who we've done 6 and 7 interventions with, who have relapsed after every one, who we're not finished with.
So you have a wonderful perspective, and that's, you know, that this may require numerous, I won't say false starts, but something like that it's going to take several interventions before there's a take.
That's right. Yeah. That's right, before there's a permanent take.
And that doesn't mean failure along the way. It's just the nature of the illness that there's going to have to be a lot of testing and on the wagon, off the wagon.
That's right. It's a chronic illness, and it continues on, and it's something that needs, sometimes it needs intervention over and over. And there's still some benefit. I mean, to the person that we've done 6 or 7 interventions with that continues to relapse. He's sober for 6 months and uses for 6 months, and is sober for 6 months and uses for 6 months. He's a lot better off than if we had never intervened and he had simply used for 7 consecutive years or 6 consecutive years. So, you know, so even then I have a hard time calling it a failure, not just from our own perspective, but this is something that requires some attention and some time. And so it's kind of difficult to define success and failure.
Now, would some of your officers, maybe junior to you, be more cynical? And if so, how do you deal with that? And maybe we ought to talk a little bit about training and some of the training issues.
Sure. You know, I would have thought that. I really would have. And it's hard to say whether older officers or younger officers would be more cynical. But to be quite candid, I found the officers to be very receptive. In a way, it gives them another option when they're dealing with a situation. They've been on a house call. You know, in these days, the way policing is today, and with community policing, our officers tend to work the same sector all the time so that they get to know people. So if there's a substance abuse problem in a particular household, and it occurs during the evening when the husband gets home from work, for instance, it's liable to be the same officer who goes there over and over. And our officers are really of the mindset today and have been trained to look for solutions to these problems. And when they get to a call, particular repeat call, where they know the underlying cause is substance abuse, it's nice for them to be able to call us and say, you know, I've got a guy here who I think you really need to talk to. And over the last couple of years, we've involved uniformed patrol officers in our interventions more and more, and particularly in those cases where they bring the interventions to us. And on a few occasions, I've been surprised that particular officers were the ones that came forward that said, you know, if you give me a hand, I'd like to do something. And sometimes they want to stay involved, and other times they just assume that we do the intervention and maybe let them know how it goes. And we're flexible with that. Either way is fine. You mentioned training.
Yes.
I teach for the Criminal Justice Training Council. That's a state agency in Massachusetts that's responsible for the training of police officers statewide. And they train in about 3 or 4 different ways. They run the police academies where recruits attend for 22 weeks. They run the in-service program, which involves every officer going for 40 hours of training every year. And we participate in that. From September through June, we have 2 to 3 officers per week away at in-service training for a full week, where they brush up on criminal law and motor vehicle law and use of deadly force and so forth. And then the third way they do training is specialized training. They'll send detectives to a 2-week school on narcotics enforcement or a 1-week school on rape investigation. A few years ago, we offered to do a school, an in-service school. at the Canton training site where the Norwood officers go on drug enforcement, and at least half of that had to do with drug intervention and kind of familiarizing officers with the drug intervention technique and how it's done. And because it's so involved, I mean, just for the hour that we've been talking about it, we've just really been able to skim the surface. Your viewing audience wouldn't be able to actually go out and do this. So it's difficult to train on in just a few hours, but we tried to bring officers up to speed on understanding what it was all about and how it worked. And we ended with offering to send them more materials and so forth. And they also got a handout when they went to the class. So every Norwood officer went to that training. That was about 2 years ago. And every patrol officer and detective from all the surrounding communities attended the same training.
Well, you have such a positive outlook, and I think you have a very kind of almost optimistic view that interventions will be helpful. Are you able to train that? Are you able to convey that to other officers?
Some officers are more receptive than others. Some obviously, and you hear, listen, we're not social workers. I maintain we're probably the ultimate social workers.
Absolutely.
But some officers will say, gee, we're not social workers, and that's really beyond what the police can do. And some of them feel that their departments just don't have the time, or they individually don't have the time to spend 3 or 4 hours with 2 officers doing an intervention, which is really what it takes. But by the same token, I really did, and I was a little surprised, I'll admit, to find that they were really receptive to the idea that, when they got to a radio call and there had been some sort of a verbal argument and they were basically going to calm things down and leave the scene, that there's something more that they could do. They could really pick up the phone and in our department call us and say, you've really got to follow up with this person, there's some substance abuse. Or our shift commanders have done that. We have shift commanders that get warrants of apprehension for people who abuse alcohol all the time. Sometimes these interventions come about as a result of domestic assaults, where not only has the husband been arrested or there's been a restraining order issued or whatever, but they do the follow-up and make sure that the substance abuse is addressed. And I think it's important in these days of problem solving and community policing that departments take kind of a holistic or a systems or a problem solving approach.
Well, thanks to you, it sounds like the Norwood Department is. So let me say in closing, thank you very much. I think this has been very, very helpful, and I'm glad we had the opportunity to focus really on substance abuse as a community issue. It's a big, big problem, and as you suggested, we only scratched the surface, so maybe we'll have to have you back someday and sort of look at the schools and look at all the service agencies and look at the whole network of related problems that are an outgrowth of this one. So I really appreciate you being here today, Detective Sergeant.
Thank you for having me.